The Arctic night had swallowed the world by mid-afternoon on Christmas Eve, 1994. In the tiny fishing village of Sørvær, perched on the ragged edge of the island of Skria in northern Norway, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the warm, flickering glow of windows decorated for the holidays. Inside the wooden houses, families were gathering for the traditional dinner, passing plates of pork ribs and lutefisk, unwrapping gifts, and trying to ignore the violence raging just outside their walls. The weather was not merely bad. It was apocalyptic, a ferocious winter storm hammering the Finnmark coast, driving snow horizontally through the air, and whipping the Norwegian Sea into a chaotic frenzy of black water and freezing foam. The wind howled through the eaves of the houses with a voice that sounded like a living thing, rattling the window panes and burying the roads in drifts of snow, creating the kind of night where no human being should be outside, and certainly no ship should be near the coast. But out in the darkness, invisible to the villagers celebrating their holiday, a desperate struggle for survival was taking place. Battling the 40-foot swells was the ocean-going tug Sandy Cape, a tough vessel built for heavy work, but tonight she was outmatched. Her engines were screaming at maximum revolutions, fighting to keep her bow into the wind, but she was being dragged backward by a dead weight that defied description. Tethered to her stern by a heavy steel cable was a monster from a fallen empire, the Russian cruiser Murmansk. She was a Sverdlov-class light cruiser, a relic of the Cold War, built by the Soviet Union in the 1950s to hunt down NATO convoys. Nearly 700 feet of gray armored steel bristling with gun turrets that were now empty and silent. She had been decommissioned, sold for scrap, and was being towed from the icebound ports of Russia to the ship-breaking yards of India, a hollow shell destined for the smelter that seemed to have woken up in the grip of the Arctic gale. The cruiser was acting like a giant sail as the gale-force winds caught her towering superstructure and her massive funnels, pushing her relentlessly toward the rocky coast, while the tugboat captain fought with everything he had, maneuvering his vessel in the troughs of the waves to pull the beast away from the shore. The tension on the tow line was immense, a physical connection between the struggling tug and the drifting warship that was vibrating with hundreds of tons of force until the physics of the storm delivered the final verdict. There was no warning when the tug crested a massive wave, while the Murmansk plunged into a deep trough, causing the two ships to move apart with violent speed. The steel tow line, stretched beyond its breaking point, gave up without a sound that could be heard or wind, simply parting and whipping back into the sea to disappear into the frothing water. On the bridge of the tug, the captain watched the radar screen in horror as the blip representing the Murmansk began to drift away, moving free and heading directly toward the lights of Sørvær. The villagers thought the storm was their only enemy that night, unaware that a radioactive ghost ship armed with a legacy of cold, war poisons was about to crash into their front yard and stay there for 20 years. If you want to uncover the dark history hidden in the world's most dangerous wrecks, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you are about to enter the exclusion zone of the cruiser Murmansk. Back in the village, the first sign that something was wrong wasn't a visual one, but a feeling as the ground suddenly shuddered beneath the floorboards. It was a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the bedrock of the island and rattled the dishes on the holiday tables, confusing the locals who looked at each other with the realization that it felt like an earthquake, a rarity in Norway. Then came the noise, a grinding, tearing screech of metal against stone, so loud and alien that it cut through the howling of the wind, sounding as if the earth itself was being ripped open by a giant hand. A few brave souls donned their heavy coats and ventured out into the blizzard, fighting their way to the edge of the breakwater to shine their flashlights into the swirling snow, expecting to see a fishing boat that had broken its moorings or perhaps debris from the storm. What they saw stopped their hearts. Looming out of the darkness and towering over the village like a skyscraper was a wall of gray steel, so close they could almost touch it, blocking out the horizon and the sea with its incomprehensible size. The Murmansk had not just run aground. She had driven herself hard onto the rocks directly in front of the village, her bow smashed against the granite shelf, and her stern swinging wildly in the surf. She sat there, a dark, silent fortress of war, invading a peaceful Christmas celebration, a shock so absolute that the villagers could only stare in disbelief. In the morning light, the true scale of the intrusion became clear, as the massive ship revealed her gun turrets pointing aimlessly at the sky, and her radar masts coated in ice, looking like a beast that had crawled out of the ocean to die on the shore. For the people of Sørvær, the initial emotion was fear, driven by questions of whether the ship was armed, if there was a crew on board, or if fuel would leak and destroy their fishing grounds. But as the days turned into weeks, the fear turned into a strange curiosity, because the ship wasn't moving. The tugs tried to pull her off, but she was stuck fast, wedged into the rocks by the power of the Atlantic, leading to arguments between the Russians and the Norwegians over responsibility, while the salvage companies looked at the violent surf and shook their heads. The Murmansk was abandoned, and the villagers began to treat the wreck as a tourist attraction, a spectacular sight of a Soviet warship parked in a Norwegian fjord that drew people from all over the country to take photos. Kids dared each other to climb onto the rusty deck, turning the wreck into a playground and a massive steel jungle gym sitting in the surf. But the Murmansk was not a playground. It was a tomb, deep inside the ship, behind the sealed bulkheads and in the dark compartments that the children didn't reach. Something was leaking. The ship was not just made of steel and iron. It was a product of the Soviet nuclear age, painted with chemicals that were banned in the West, filled with toxic fluids in its electrical systems, and containing tiny, deadly sources of radiation in safety switches scattered throughout the vessel. The villagers looked at the rusty hull and saw an eyesore, not realizing they were looking at a dirty bomb in slow motion. The Murmansk had crashed on Christmas Eve, but the real gift she had brought to Sørvær was a poison that would take 2 decades to clean up, proving that while the physical crash was over, the silent catastrophe was just beginning. To truly understand the menacing presence that had parked itself on the rocky shoreline of Sørvær, one must look beyond the rusted metal of 1994 and travel back to the height of the Cold War, to a time when the ship was not a wreck, but a weapon designed to end civilizations. The Murmansk was born in the closed city of Sverdlov in 1955, a product of Stalin's final naval ambition to challenge the supremacy of the West on the open ocean. She was a Sverdlov-class cruiser, one of the last great all-gun warships ever built, a masterpiece of Soviet naval architecture designed with a singular, terrifying purpose. While the Americans were experimenting with missiles, the Soviets built a fleet of these heavily armored leviathans to break out into the North Atlantic, hunt down NATO supply convoys, and starve Europe into submission in the event of World War III. For 35 years, the Murmansk patrolled the freezing waters of the Barents Sea and the North Atlantic, a gray wolf lurking on the horizon. She was the pride of the Northern Fleet, carrying a crew of over 1,000 sailors, her decks polished to a shine. Her 14 6-inch guns capable of hurling high-explosive shells over 15 miles with pinpoint accuracy. She was a symbol of the seemingly invincible power of the Soviet Union, a floating fortress that shadowed American carrier groups and played cat-and-mouse games with NATO, frigates in the endless twilight of the Arctic Circle. But the empire she served was rotting from the inside, and when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the great cruiser became an orphan of history overnight. The mighty Northern Fleet, once the terror of the West, was left to rust at its moorings in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Murmansk was stripped of her ammunition, her sensitive electronics, and her dignity, left to freeze in the ice alongside dozens of her sister ships. In the chaotic capitalist free-for-all of the early 1990s, she was no longer seen as a warship, but as 14,000 tons of high-grade steel they could be turned into quick cash. She was sold to a scrapper in the United Arab Emirates for a fraction of her construction cost, destined to be towed to the beaches of Along in India, cut into razor blades and forgotten. The journey was supposed to be her funeral procession, but instead it became an invasion. When the tow line parted and the ship slammed into the Norwegian coast on that stormy Christmas Eve, the geopolitical situation became as messy as the wreckage itself. In the days following the grounding, a tense diplomatic standoff ensued between Oslo and Moscow. The Norwegians demanded the immediate removal of the vessel, citing the potential danger to the local environment and the sheer absurdity of having a foreign warship crashed on their territory. The Russian owners, however, looked at the violence of the surf, the jagged rocks, and the cost of a salvage operation, and claimed force majeure. They declared the ship a total loss, arguing that it was impossible to move her, and essentially washed their hands of the problem. The Murmansk was effectively abandoned, a massive steel squatter that refused to be evicted. For the residents of Sørvær, the initial shock of the intrusion slowly gave way to a strange form of acceptance. The ship wasn't going anywhere, so it became part of the landscape, a new, permanent island of iron that altered the view from their kitchen windows. In the summer months, when the midnight sun bathed the Arctic in 24 hours of light, the wreck became a magnet for the curious. It was a surreal spectacle, a piece of heavy industrial history sitting accessible in the surf. And it didn't take long for the locals to start exploring. Teenagers from the village would dare each other to swim out to the hull at low tide or climb across the ropes that had been rigged by early scavengers. They treated the cruiser like a giant jungle gym, scrambling up the rusting ladders to the bridge, sitting in the captain's chair, and wandering through the cavernous, echoing hangars that had once housed helicopters. Photographers flocked to the site to capture the contrast between the brutalist Soviet architecture and the pristine Norwegian nature, snapping pictures of seabirds nesting in the gun barrels and moss growing on the teak decks. To the casual observer, the Murmansk was a romantic ruin, a harmless giant that was slowly returning to nature. However, the ship was fighting a losing battle against the Norwegian Sea. The Atlantic Ocean is a relentless solvent, and it began to eat the cruiser alive. Winter after winter, storms hammered the hull, pushing it further onto the rocks and grinding the bottom plates until they shredded. The ship developed a severe list to starboard, tilting crazy into the surf as the internal compartments flooded. The paint began to peel in great sheets, revealing the red lead primer underneath, and the pristine gray armor turned into a scab of orange rust that bled into the surrounding water, staining the white foam of the waves with the color of dried blood. But while the visible decay was dramatic, it was the invisible decay that should have terrified the visitors climbing through the dark corridors. The Murmansk was a time capsule of 1950s industrial chemistry, built in an era when environmental safety was non-existent. Deep in her bowels, transformers were filled with thousands of gallons of oil containing polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, a highly toxic carcinogen that does not break down in nature. The insulation wrapping the miles of steam pipes was made of pure asbestos. The paint on the hull was laden with heavy metals like lead and cadmium to prevent barnacle growth. And there was something even more insidious hidden in the darkness. Scattered throughout the ship, in the luminescent dials of the gauges, in the smoke detectors, and in the emergency signage, were radioactive isotopes. The Soviets had used promethium-147 and thorium to make things glow in the dark and to trigger sensors. As the ship rotted and the interior crumbled, these sources were exposed, waiting in the gloom. The children playing on the bridge and the tourists posing for photos by the gun turrets or walking through a hazardous waste site without a Geiger counter, completely oblivious to the fact that the sleeping giant beneath their feet was slowly leaking a poison that would haunt the village for generations. The Murmansk was not just a shipwreck. She was a dirty bomb waiting for the corrosion to pull the trigger. For nearly a decade, the residents of Sørvær lived with the steel giant as if it were a strange, overgrown pet that had wandered into their yard and refused to leave. The Murmansk became woven into the fabric of daily life in the village, a fixed point on the horizon that marked the changing of the seasons. In winter, she was a white mountain of ice and snow, blending into the blizzards. In summer, she was a stark, rusting monument against the midnight sun, casting long shadows over the rich fishing grounds that sustained the local economy. The fear of the initial impact had faded into a dull acceptance, and the ship had become a backdrop for family photos and a destination for Sunday walks along the cliffs. Her presence so constant that she became invisible to those who saw her every day. But while the village slept, the ocean was working, and the ship was changing in ways that were not immediately obvious from the shore. By the mid-2000s, the Atlantic storms had done their work, breaking the ship's back and twisting the hull so severely that the structural integrity was gone. The sea was no longer just washing around the Murmansk. It was washing through her. The tide surged in and out of the lower decks, turning the engine rooms and ammunition magazines into saltwater aquariums, where the currents swirled through miles of rotting pipework and disintegrating machinery. A ship was being digested, her insides turning into a slurry of rust and silt that was pumped out into the pristine fjord with every retreating tide. It was not until environmental scientists from the Norwegian Coastal Administration finally took a closer look at the wreck that the true nature of the tourist attraction was revealed, shattering the peaceful coexistence between the village and the vessel. They approached the ship not as sightseers, but as crime scene investigators, donning protective suits and respirators to climb aboard the rotting carcass. What they found inside the dark, dripping corridors of the cruiser was a chemical nightmare that exceeded their worst estimates. The Murmansk was not just empty steel. She was a floating hazardous waste dump that had been cracking open in slow motion for 10 years. The investigators discovered that the ship was bleeding. Hidden deep in the double-bottom tanks and in the miles of hydraulic lines were thousands of gallons of fuel oil and lubricants that had been missed during the scrapping preparations. But oil was the least of their worries. The real horror lay in the electrical transformers and capacitors that were rotting in the flooded compartments. They were filled with PCBs, a synthetic chemical used for insulation that is notoriously toxic to marine life. In the enclosed ecosystem of the fjord, where the currents trapped the water, these chemicals were not dispersing. They were accumulating. They were seeping into the sand, settling on the kelp, and entering the food chain at the microscopic level, beginning a slow climb that would eventually end on the dinner plates of the villagers. As the scientists moved deeper into the ship, their Geiger counters began to click, a dry, rhythmic warning that signaled an even more sinister threat. The Soviet Navy had built the Murmansk to fight in a nuclear war, and they had equipped her with systems designed to survive the apocalypse, often using radioactive isotopes in everyday components. The team found promethium-147 in the fire detectors, strontium-90 in the optical sights, and radium in the glow-in-the-dark paint of the instrument dials. Individually, these sources were small, but collectively, scattered across a wreck that was being pulverized by the surf, they represented a radiological hazard that was impossible to quantify. The ship was slowly grinding these isotopes into dust, creating a radioactive silt that was washing out into the bay where the village children swam in the summer. The release of the environmental report hit Sørvær harder than the ship itself had done in 1994. The local fishermen, who had prided themselves on the purity of their catch, were suddenly told that the fish and crabs living in the shadow of the cruiser might be tainted with heavy metals and carcinogens. The fear returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the fear of a crash, but the fear of an invisible, creeping poison that had already been leaking for a decade. The parents who had let their teenagers climb on the wreck looked at the photos of the rusting, jagged metal with a new sense of dread, wondering what dust they had brought home on their clothes. The romantic image of the harmless giant evaporated overnight, replaced by the realization that the village was living next to a ticking time bomb. The Norwegian government faced a crisis as the public outcry grew louder. They could no longer hide behind the excuse that the ship was too difficult or expensive to move because the cost of doing nothing was suddenly far higher. The Murmansk was effectively a dirty bomb sitting in a national nature reserve, and the fuse was burning down with every winter storm that tore another piece of metal from the hull. The decision was finally made. The ghost ship had to die, but killing a monster of that size in one of the most hostile environments on Earth would require an engineering miracle that had never been attempted before. The decision to remove the Murmansk was made in the sterile, quiet offices of the Norwegian government, where politicians signed papers and allocated budgets with the stroke of a pen. But the reality of executing that decision fell to a different breed of people, the salvage engineers of the AF Decom, a company specializing in the destruction of heavy industrial nightmares. When the team arrived in Sørvær in 2009 to survey the job, they stood on the windswept cliffs and looked down at the wreck with a mixture of professional respect and sheer disbelief. The challenge facing them was not just difficult. It was bordering on the impossible, a puzzle of physics and logistics that had no precedent in maritime history. The standard method for removing a shipwreck is to cut it into large chunks underwater using divers and heavy cranes, lifting the pieces onto a barge one by one. But the Murmansk had parked herself in the splash zone, the most violent strip of the ocean, where the waves break against the shore. No crane barge could survive there. The swell would smash it against the rocks in hours. Divers could not work there. The currents and the jagged metal would kill them. The ship was stuck in a blind spot of engineering, too deep for land-based equipment and too shallow for naval vessels. The engineers realized that they could not bring the machines to the ship, so they had to bring the land to the ship. The plan they conceived was audacious, bordering on madness. If they couldn't work in the water, they would remove the water. They decided to build a massive dry dock around the wreck, right there in the open ocean. They would construct huge walls of rock and steel to encircle the 14,000-ton cruiser, pump out millions of gallons of seawater, and turn the seabed into a dry construction site. Essentially, they were going to part the Red Sea for the sake of a pile of scrap metal. The construction of the cofferdam began in 2010, transforming the quiet bay of Sørvær into a massive industrial quarry. For months, a fleet of dump trucks rumbled through the village, carrying thousands of tons of rock and gravel to build the breakwaters that would form the outer walls of the trap. The weather fought them every step of the way. Winter storms washed away days of progress overnight, scattering the rocks like pebbles and forcing the team to start again. The engineers worked in freezing spray and 20-hour darkness, racing against the seasons to close the circle before the worst of the Atlantic gales returned. Finally, the ring was closed. Massive sheet piles interlocking steel plates were driven deep into the seabed to seal the dam against the pressure of the ocean. Then came the moment of truth. Giant industrial pumps were lowered into the lagoon formed by the walls, and they began to suck the Atlantic Ocean out of the enclosure. Slowly, inch by inch, the water level dropped. For the first time in 16 years, the hull of the Murmansk began to emerge from the deep. As the water receded, the true extent of the damage was revealed to the naked eye, a sight that was both fascinating and horrifying. The ship didn't look like a vessel anymore. She looked like a biological specimen pinned to a dissection table. The hull was draped in a thick carpet of kelp, mussels, and sea anemones, a dying ecosystem clinging to the rotting steel. The metal itself was unrecognizable, eaten away by corrosion until it resembled Swiss cheese, with gaping holes that allowed a clear view into the dark, flooded machinery spaces. The ship leaned heavily to starboard, resting on the crushed remains of her own superstructure, a broken, defeated giant exposed to the air for the first time since the crash. But the drawing of the dock revealed something else: the snow. As the water vanished, it left behind a thick layer of sludge composed of rotting marine life, leaked fuel oil, and decaying insulation. The stench wafted over the village, a chemical funk that reminded everyone why this operation was necessary. The engineers, walking on the newly exposed seabed in their rubber boots, were now standing on the bottom of the ocean, looking up at a wall of steel that towered 5 stories above their heads. They had succeeded in changing the geography of Norway, turning a piece of the sea into dry land. Now, the real work could begin. The demolition zone was ready. But this was not going to be a simple demolition. They couldn't just blow it up or smash it with wrecking balls because of the toxic payload hidden inside. It had to be a surgical dismantling, a process of carefully peeling back the layers of the ship to extract the poison without releasing it into the air or the ground. The Murmansk was about to be dissected, piece by radioactive piece, in the most expensive and complex recycling project the Arctic had ever seen. The ghost was trapped, but it still had teeth, and the men entering the dry dock knew that the most dangerous part of the job was just beginning. With the Atlantic Ocean held back by the massive walls of the cofferdam, the Murmansk sat exposed and vulnerable on the dry seabed, stripped of the mystery that had protected her for nearly 2 decades. The ship that had once been a majestic fortress of the Soviet Union was now reduced to a rotting carcass, a sprawling mass of corroded steel and marine growth that stank of decay and heavy fuel. But there was no time for sentimentality, because the demolition team from AF Decom was ready to launch the final assault, turning the silent bay of Sørvær into a deafening theater of industrial destruction. The attack began with the arrival of the dinosaurs. These were massive, long-reach excavators, their hydraulic arms extending over 100 feet into the air, fitted not with buckets, but with enormous hydraulic shears, capable of cutting through solid steel plate as if it were cardboard. They crawled onto the muddy floor of the dry dock like scavengers approaching a fallen beast, their diesel engines roaring as they positioned themselves around the perimeter of the cruiser. When the first machine bit into the hull, the sound was not an explosion, but a high-pitched scream of torturing metal that echoed off the cliffs, signaling the beginning of the end for the last gun cruiser of the Cold War. However, simply tearing the ship apart was not an option due to the toxic cocktail hidden within her bulkheads. The demolition had to be a carefully choreographed dance between brute force and surgical precision. Before the heavy machines could rip down a section of the superstructure, teams of workers in full hazmat suits and respirators had to enter the wreck to sanitize it. These men were the frontline soldiers in the war against the ship's poison, climbing through the tilted, sludge-filled corridors where the air was thick with mold and the dust of asbestos. They moved through the darkness with flashlights, manually stripping away the insulation from the steam pipes, bagging the carcinogenic fibers that had kept the ship warm during her Arctic patrols. The most nerve-wracking part of the operation was the hunt for the radiological sources. Every room, every instrument panel, and every fire detector had to be scanned with Geiger counters before it could be scrapped. The ship was riddled with promethium-147 and radium, hidden in the dials that had once glowed in the dark to guide the sailors. The salvage team found hundreds of these sources, tiny, invisible specks of radiation that had to be carefully extracted with tweezers and placed into lead-lined containers. It was a tedious, dangerous game of hide-and-seek played in a structure that was literally crumbling around them, where a single misstep could send a worker plunging through a rusted deck into the flooded bilges below. As the weeks turned into months, the Murmansk began to disappear, eaten from the top down by the relentless appetite of the hydraulic shears. The imposing radar masts were the first to fall, toppling into the mud with a ground-shaking thud. Then the bridge, where the captain had once commanded the vessel, was sliced away, exposing the officers' quarters to the open air. The armored gun turrets, which had once threatened NATO convoys, were cut into manageable chunks and dropped onto the waiting trucks. The ship was being erased, Processed into thousands of tons of scrap metal, they were sorted into neat piles of steel, copper, and aluminum, destined to be melted down and recycled into new cars or washing machines. Yet, as the ship was peeled open, she offered up final, ghostly glimpses of the life she had once contained. The excavators exposed cabins that had been sealed since 1994, revealing a time capsule of the Soviet era frozen in rust. The workers found moldering uniforms hanging in lockers, yellowed newspapers with Cyrillic headlines praising the Communist Party, and personal letters from sailors to their families back in Russia. They found busts of Lenin and propaganda posters still clinging to the bulkheads, staring out at the Norwegian sky. For a brief moment, the human history of the vessel was laid bare, a poignant reminder that this mass of toxic waste had once been a home to thousands of young men, before the machines tore it all away and turned history into debris. The lower the demolition team went, the more difficult the job became. The bottom of the ship, the double hull, was a labyrinth of crushed tanks and twisted girders that had absorbed the full force of the impact with the rocks. Here, the mixture of oil, water, and sediment was a thick black sludge that coated everything in a slippery, toxic glaze. The workers had to use high-pressure water cannons to blast the muck away, creating a contaminated runoff that had to be captured and treated by a dedicated filtration plant built on the site. Every drop of water, every ounce of sand, had to be scrubbed clean to ensure that the Murmansk didn't leave a poisoned legacy behind. By the summer of 2012, the towering wall of steel that had blocked the view of the horizon for 18 years was gone. The excavators were now picking at the keel, the very spine of the ship, lifting the last heavy plates from the bedrock. The impossible dry dock had worked. The engineers had successfully disassembled a radioactive warship in the middle of a nature reserve without spilling a drop of poison into the sea. The monster had been slain, dismembered, and trucked away, leaving only a scar in the mud where it had rested. But the final act of the drama was not the removal of the steel. It was the restoration of the land. The village of Sørvær watched as the machines began to dismantle the cofferdam itself, pulling the sheet piles out of the seabed and removing the millions of tons of rock they had brought in. They were not just cleaning up a wreck. They were attempting to heal the wound, to return the bay to the pristine state it had been in before that fateful Christmas Eve. The goal was total erasure, to make it so that a visitor standing on the shore would never know that a Soviet Leviathan had ever been there. The ghost was gone, but the question remained, could the village ever truly forget the shadow that had hung over them for a generation? By the time the winter storms returned to the Finnmark coast in late 2012, the deafening roar of the hydraulic shears and the rumble of the dump trucks had finally faded, replaced once again by the eternal, howling voice of the wind. The industrial city that had sprung up in the Bay of Sørvær cranes, the filtration plants, the barracks for the workers, was dismantled with the same efficiency used to destroy the ship. The massive excavators, which had feasted on the carcass of the Murmansk like iron dinosaurs, were loaded onto barges and shipped south to their next meal, leaving behind a landscape that looked raw and wounded, a muddy scar on the seabed where a mountain of steel had stood for nearly 2 decades. The final act of the project was the most symbolic. The engineers returned to the massive walls of the cofferdam, the barrier that had held back the Atlantic Ocean for 3 years. Slowly, they began to pull the steel sheet piles from the ground and breach the rock levees. There was no ceremony, just the simple inevitability of gravity and fluid dynamics. As the walls came down, the Norwegian sea rushed back in, reclaiming the territory it had lost. The water swirled over the spot where the cruiser's keel had ground against the bedrock, washing away the tire tracks of the trucks and the last stubborn stains of oil. It filled the depressions in the sand and covered the jagged rocks, smoothing over the violence of the demolition until the surface was once again a seamless, rolling sheet of gray water. If you were to visit Sørvær today and stand on the breakwater where the villagers once gathered in shock On that Christmas Eve in 1994, you would see absolutely nothing. The view is pristine. The jagged silhouette that blocked the horizon is gone. The radioactive warning signs have been taken down. The water is clear, and the fish have returned to the shallows, swimming through the exact space where the Murmansk's reactor-hardened steel once radiated poison. The cleanup was a triumph of modern engineering, a perfect erasure that cost the Norwegian government nearly $50 million, more than the original cost of building the ship itself. It stands as one of the few times in history where humanity has successfully hit undo on a massive environmental disaster. However, while the physical ship has been melted down and recycled into rebar or razor blades, the ghost of the Murmansk lingers in the collective memory of the Arctic. For the people of Sørvær, the bay will never be truly empty. They look at the open water and still see the phantom outline of the gun turrets and the radar masts. They remember the years of uncertainty, the fear of the invisible radiation, and the strange, hulking neighbor that watched over their children as they grew up. The ship taught them a harsh lesson about the legacy of the Cold War, that the weapons of the past do not simply vanish when peace is declared. They rust, they leak, and they wait. The destruction of the Murmansk serves as a grim warning for the rest of the world, because she was not unique. She was merely the one that got caught. Across the northern hemisphere, in the remote harbors of the Kola Peninsula and the rusting graveyards of the former Soviet Union, there are dozens of other ships just like her. Nuclear submarines with rotting hulls, cruisers filled with asbestos and PCBs, and icebreakers loaded with spent fuel are still waiting for their final disposal. They are ticking time bombs, tethered to crumbling piers by rusting chains, waiting for a storm strong enough to snap a line or a hull plate thin enough to burst. The Murmansk was a bullet that the world dodged. It crashed in a place where it could be seen, on a coast rich enough to pay for the cleanup, and in a country with the political will to act. If she had sunk in the deep ocean, her toxic payload would have been released silently into the currents. If she had crashed on a poorer coast, she might still be there today, leaking her poison into the food chain of a community unable to fight back. She was a lucky disaster, a catastrophe that was contained before it could become a tragedy. Ultimately, the story of the Murmansk is a testament to the persistence of matter. We build these leviathans of steel and fill them with the most dangerous substances known to science in the name of national defense, assuming that we will always be around to manage them. But empires fall, economies collapse, and ships are sold for scrap to the lowest bidder. The Murmansk proved that you cannot simply throw a warship away, because there is no away. There is only the ocean. And eventually, the ocean returns everything we give it. Today, the metal that made up the hull of the Murmansk is likely part of a bridge in Europe, a car in Asia, or a skyscraper in the Middle East. The atoms of the Soviet giant have been scattered across the globe, repurposed for a peaceful world she was never designed to see. But back in Sørvær, when the winter storms blow in from the north and the waves crash against the empty rocks, you can almost hear the grinding screech of metal on stone, a ghostly echo of the Christmas visitor that came to stay and forced a village to fight a 20-year war against a dead ship. The horizon is clear, but the scar on the memory of the landscape will never truly heal.